Everyone laughed at my accent in the interview, until I got the job. I remember exactly the smell of that morning. It was that kind of artificial scent that American commercial buildings have. Strong air conditioning, new carpet, and fresh coffee mixed into something that seems to say, "You don't belong here." I had woken up at 5 in the morning, spent 40 minutes choosing between my only navy blazer and a blouse my mother had given me before I boarded the plane. I chose the blazer. I folded the blouse carefully and put it back in the suitcase, as if it were a promise I wasn't yet authorized to keep. The address was on the 42nd floor of a skyscraper in downtown Austin, Texas. I had researched the route 4 times over the previous 3 days. I left my apartment, a tiny room I shared with another woman who worked night shifts, so we almost never saw each other, an hour and a half early. I sat on a cold metal bench outside the building for 40 minutes, holding the printed resume I had reviewed so many times I had practically memorized it. My name is Neha Reddy. I am 32 years old. I am a programmer. And that morning, I was about to walk into the most important interview of my life. The company was called Meridian Tech Solutions, an American multinational with offices in 18 countries, a client of some of the world's largest financial institutions, and one of the few companies in the sector that paid salaries that, to me, sounded like something out of a movie. When I saw the job posting, I stared at the screen for a long time before pressing the apply button. Not because I doubted my technical ability, but because I knew exactly the kind of thing that happens when a woman with my accent walks into a room full of American recruiters. I had been through it before, but I'll get to that shortly. The elevator was mirrored, and I avoided looking at my own reflection during the entire ride up. It wasn't insecurity, it was strategy. I had learned that, before an interview, looking at yourself too long in a mirror activates a kind of self-criticism that serves no purpose. Instead, I did what I always do. I breathed deeply and repeated quietly, just with my lips, something my mathematics teacher in Hyderabad used to write on the blackboard. Jnanam eva balam. Knowledge is power. The elevator doors opened, and I walked into the reception area. The waiting room was large, modern, with those beige leather armchairs that looked too expensive for anyone to actually sit in. There were other candidates. I counted 6 people as I approached the receptionist to check in. 4 men, 2 women, all well-dressed, all with that kind of posture that comes from having grown up in an environment where you are expected to take up space. I sat in a chair near the window, slightly apart from the main group. I opened my small notebook, an old habit I never abandoned, and began mentally reviewing possible technical questions. Data structures, sorting algorithms, time complexity, microservices architecture. I had spent the last 3 months preparing with a discipline that would be hard to explain to someone who had never had to fight to prove they deserved to be somewhere. It was then that I heard it. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of thing people say when they think you're not paying attention, or when they simply don't care if you hear or not. One of the men, white dress shirt, neatly combed hair, that kind of confidence that comes from never having been doubted, said something to the woman beside him. I didn't hear the whole sentence. I only heard the last words, spoken with that slightly twisted smile I already knew by heart, with that accent. The woman beside him, blonde hair, red lipstick, a resume clipped to a transparent folder, put her hand over her mouth and laughed. Discreetly, but she laughed. I didn't lift my eyes from the notebook. On the outside, I was completely calm. My expression didn't change. My hands didn't tremble. I kept running my fingers over the same page, as if that conversation were simply background noise, like the air conditioning or the muffled sound of a printer in some room down the hall. On the inside, however, something different happened. It wasn't anger, it wasn't shame. It was something more like a cold clarity that descended through my chest and settled in my stomach, quiet and firm, like a stone at the bottom of a river. I had felt that before. It was the feeling that precedes every time I prove someone wrong about me. And I knew, with a certainty that depended on no external validation, that this interview was going to end in a way they weren't expecting. My name was called at 9:42. I stood up, put the notebook in my bag, straightened my blazer, and walked toward the door where an HR assistant waited for me with a polite smile and a visitor badge. As we walked through the hallway, she asked if I had traveled from far away. I replied that I had lived in Austin for 2 years. She said she loved India, that she had a friend who had traveled to Goa, and that the food was incredible. I replied that I agreed, that the food really was incredible. The interview room was smaller than I had imagined. A long table, 4 chairs on one side, 1 on the other. 3 people were waiting for me. A middle-aged woman I would later identify as the director of engineering, a younger man who was the technical lead for the position, and a third person from corporate HR with a tablet in hand and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I greeted each one by name because I had researched everyone's profile on LinkedIn the night before. The three of them exchanged glances briefly. That was already unusual. I sat down. I placed my bag beside the chair. I took out a second printed resume. I always bring two, and placed it on the table facing them. The director of engineering was the first to speak. She had the kind of voice that conveys authority without needing to raise the volume. She thanked me for coming and said the interview would have two parts, a technical one and a behavioral one. She asked if I had any questions before we began. I replied that I didn't. She nodded slightly, opened the notebook in front of her, and said the sentence that, without her knowing, was exactly the kind of thing I had been preparing for my entire life. So, Neha, tell me a little about your journey. I breathed deeply, and I began. There is something that happens when you grew up with little. It's not exactly humility. It's not exactly resilience. It's something harder to name. A kind of constant awareness that every resource has weight, that every opportunity has an expiration date, and that the luxury of wasting time belongs to other people. I grew up with that awareness installed somewhere between my chest and my stomach, working like a silent metronome that never stopped. I was born in Hyderabad, in the state of Telangana, in southern India. My father, Ravi Reddy, worked as an administrative assistant at a small logistics company. My mother, Sulachana, sewed clothes to order at home and gave private mathematics lessons to neighborhood children. Together, they earned enough to pay rent on a two-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood, put food on the table, and keep me and my younger brother, Arjun, in a decent public school. There was no surplus. There were no vacations. There was no margin for error. What there was, however, was something whose value I would only understand much later. There were books. My mother had a small bookshelf, made of dark wood and slightly crooked, leaning against the living room wall. On it, between old mathematics textbooks and some Telugu novels she had inherited from her own mother, there was a collection of books in English that she had bought over the years at a used bookstore near the market. She didn't speak English fluently, but she believed, with a conviction that never wavered, that English would be the door that would open the world to her children. I started picking up those books at 8 years old. I understood almost nothing, but I had a red-covered dictionary that always sat beside me, and I would spend hours with those two things open at the same time, building sentences word by word like someone assembling a puzzle without the picture on the box as a reference. It was slow, frustrating, and completely absurd to anyone watching from the outside, but I enjoyed it. There was something in it that gave me a feeling I couldn't find anywhere else, the feeling that the world was becoming slightly larger. At school, I was a good student. Not the best in class. That title belonged to a boy named Siddharth, who memorized everything with an ease that irritated and impressed me in equal measure. But I was consistent, and consistency, I would discover later, is worth far more than flashes of brilliance that appear and disappear. When I was 12, a teacher named Murthy arrived at our school. He taught computer science at a time when most public schools didn't yet have a decent computer lab. Ours had 4 old computers, 2 of which crashed with worrying frequency. Teacher Murthy used those 4 computers as if they were the most precious resource in the universe. He divided the class into groups, created rotation schedules, and when students complained about the limited time, he would say something that became permanently etched in me. The computer is just a tool. What you build with it depends on what you have in your head, not on how much time you spend in front of the screen. I took that seriously in a way he probably didn't expect. I began copying by hand the programming exercises he wrote on the board. There was no way to practice at home. We didn't have a computer. So I wrote the code in my notebook like regular text, line by line, and then tried to execute it mentally, tracing what each command would do. It was a way of programming without a computer that seemed absurd, but that, looking back, gave me something few people have. I truly understood what the code was doing, not just how to make it work. At 14, my father managed to get a second-hand computer from a coworker who had bought a new model. It was slow, noisy, and the fan made a sound as if it were about to fall apart at any moment. But it was ours. I treated it like gold. My mother established a fair rule. Arjun and I shared computer time, 2 hours each, at night, after dinner. I used every minute of my 2 hours with an intensity that seems almost comical to me now. There was no broadband internet back then. There was a dial-up connection that cost by the minute, and my mother controlled usage with surgical precision. So I downloaded what I needed during the day at the neighborhood internet cafe for 1 rupee and 20 per hour, saved it to a flash drive, and then studied at home without needing to stay connected. That was how I truly learned programming. Python first, then Java, then data structures I studied through English language tutorials that I had to pause every 3 lines to consult the dictionary. English and programming grew together inside me, intertwined in a way that to this day I can't fully separate. Learning to program taught me to think in English in a logical way, and learning English opened me up to a universe of technical material that simply didn't exist in Telugu or Hindi with the same depth. When I turned 18 and needed to decide what to do with my life, the choice was clear to me. The problem was money. The decent computer engineering colleges in Hyderabad cost more than my family could comfortably pay. There were scholarships, but the competition was fierce. Hundreds of thousands of students competing for limited spots in national exams that determined the future of an entire generation based on a single day of testing. I prepared for 2 years. I woke up at 4:30 in the morning, studied before school, studied after school, slept little, ate quickly, and lived in a bubble of focus that probably wasn't very healthy, but that was the only path I could see. I passed the exam, not with a score high enough for the most prestigious institutions, but high enough for a solid public university that offered a partial scholarship. My mother cried. My father was silent for a long time and then said, his voice slightly catching, that I had done what he had dreamed of for himself decades ago and had never managed. I promised I wouldn't waste it. The 4 years of college were the most intense of my life until then. I worked part-time at a call center on weekends to help with expenses. I spent nights studying. I slept 5 hours on a good day. There were moments of exhaustion that came close to the limit, when I asked myself whether I was being smart or simply stubborn. But I kept going, and it was in college that English began to become a problem in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not in the technical sense. I wrote well, understood well, read quickly. The problem was when I spoke. My accent, the accent of someone who learned English watching American films paused on a slow computer in a dark room in Hyderabad, was strong, marked, unmistakably Indian, with that cadence particular to Telugu that bends certain consonants and stresses syllables in ways a native speaker finds immediately perceptible. In some situations, that didn't matter at all. In others, I felt precisely how much it did. In a 5th semester seminar, I presented a paper on compression algorithms I had developed through months of research. The professor gave me a high grade, but a classmate, someone who had copied most of his own paper from a public repository, asked a question after the presentation that wasn't really a question. It was a performance for the class. He said, smiling slightly, "Could you repeat that?" I couldn't quite understand. Some laughed. I repeated it, slowly, clearly, looking directly at him, and then continued the presentation as if nothing had happened. That day taught me something I carry to this day, the difference between being shaken and showing that you were shaken. I can feel anything inside. I can feel anger, shame, hurt. All of that is human and I deny none of it. But what I show to the world is my choice. And I chose from that day on not to give anyone the satisfaction of watching me waver. That cost me effort. It cost me loneliness. It cost me nights where I had to process in silence things that, under ideal conditions, I would have shared with someone. But it also built me. And it was exactly that built version of me that walked into that interview room in Austin, Texas in a navy blazer, with 2 printed resumes and a notebook full of notes, while someone across the room laughed discreetly at my accent. They didn't know what that accent had cost. They didn't know what that accent carried. There is a version of America that exists in movies, in TV series, in social media posts from people who traveled for 2 weeks and came back with photos at Times Square. That version is real. It exists. But there is another version too. And it is in that second version that most immigrants spend the first years of their lives in a new country. I went through both, and I can say honestly that the second version was the one that formed me most. When I arrived in the United States, I was 28 years old, an H-1B work visa sponsored by a small technology company in Dallas, 1 large suitcase, 1 carry-on bag, and a bank account with the equivalent of approximately $800 after paying the first installment of the apartment deposit. There was a college friend who had been living in Dallas for 3 years and who helped me understand the basics in the first few days, how public transportation works, where to buy cheap food, which documents needed to be sorted out first. After a week, she returned to her own routine, and I was left alone with mine. The company that had sponsored my visa was small, specializing in software development for clients in the healthcare sector. The work was technically adequate. It wasn't what I dreamed of, but it was solid, and I was learning. The problem wasn't the work, it was everything around the work. The first month was the hardest of my adult life, not because of any specific dramatic event, It was an accumulation of small things that, added together, weighed in a way I hadn't anticipated. It was the feeling of walking into a supermarket and taking twice as long to do simple shopping because every package needed to be deciphered. It was the difficulty of understanding people on the phone, American English spoken at normal speed, without subtitles, with slang and contractions I had heard but never processed in real time. It was the loneliness specific to living in a place where no one knows your name, your story, where you came from. In Hyderabad, I was Ravi and Sulachana's daughter, the girl who passed the exam, the one who had gotten the scholarship. There was a context around me that gave me substance. In Dallas, I was simply the Indian woman, with the difficult accent who worked on the second floor of the office and ate lunch alone most days. At the office, things were more complex than I had expected. There were other Indian employees. In fact, the company had a high proportion of Asian immigrants, which was common in the American technology sector. But there was an unwritten hierarchy I gradually came to understand. The more senior employees, mostly Native Americans, held leadership positions and had a kind of informal authority that wasn't on the org chart, but that everyone recognized. The newer immigrants, especially the recent arrivals, especially the women, had to constantly prove something that others didn't have to prove. I perceived this clearly in my second week of work. I was in a team meeting, discussing the architecture of a new module we were developing. I raised a technical question about efficiency. There was a point in the proposed approach that would create an unnecessary bottleneck at scale. It was a legitimate observation, and I knew it was correct because I had spent the previous night reviewing exactly that type of problem. The technical lead of the team, a man named Derek, American, competent but with a characteristic impatience toward people he considered less experienced, listened to me speak for about 15 seconds, and then turned to another colleague and continued the conversation as if I had said nothing. 3 minutes later, that same colleague raised a point very similar to mine. Derek stopped, nodded enthusiastically, and said, "Exactly. Good observation." I wrote my original observation in an email to Derek that afternoon. Polite, technical, with references. He replied with 2 lines saying he would consider it in the next revision cycle. It was not considered. The module was built with the bottleneck. 3 months later, when it went into production and began presenting exactly the problem I had predicted, there was an emergency meeting to understand what had gone wrong. I said nothing in that meeting. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned in that period that there are situations where proving you were right doesn't build bridges. It only raises walls. I kept that lesson, and kept working. The second year was different from the first, not because things became easier externally, but because I had changed internally in a way that is difficult to describe precisely. I had developed a kind of armor that was not coldness. I still felt everything, still cared deeply about the work and about the people around me. It was more a clarity about what I could control and what I couldn't. I began actively investing in what I called parallel construction. During the day, I did the work I was paid to do. At nights and on weekends, I worked on my own projects. I contributed to open source repositories. I studied technologies the company didn't use, but that the market was beginning to value. Cloud computing, microservices architecture, applied machine learning. I built a technical profile that, document by document, commit by commit, was constructing a solid body of evidence of capability that was independent of any Derek's opinion at any company. I also began working on my English more systematically. Not to eliminate the accent. That idea I had completely discarded, for a reason I will explain, but to increase my precision and speed. I recorded myself answering technical questions and listened back, identifying where I hesitated, where I lost clarity, where the rhythm broke in a way that made it harder to follow. It was a process that required setting aside the ego considerably, because listening to your own recorded voice and analyzing your own flaws is not comfortable for anyone. About eliminating the accent, I consciously decided not to do it, and that decision came from a very specific place. My accent is the way my tongue, trained from childhood by the sounds of Telugu and Hindi and English learned in an Indian context, processes and produces sounds. It tells a story. It says where I come from, what I went through, who the people are that formed me. Erasing that would not be growth. It would be a form of shame disguised as adaptation. And I had promised myself, long before arriving in America, that I would not let other people's prejudice convince me that there was something wrong with me. The accent stays. The clarity improves. That was my decision. At the end of the second year, I resigned from the Dallas company. I had secured a better position at a mid-sized company in Austin, with a salary 50% higher and a technical team that, during the interviews, had asked me real questions and listened to real answers. In Austin, things were different. Not perfect. It's never perfect anywhere, but different. There was a more open culture, a more diverse team, and a kind of respect for technical work that was independent of who produced it. I stayed 2.5 years at that company. I grew, I learned, I built a reputation. And it was during that period that the name Meridian Tech Solutions began appearing in conversations in Austin's technology sector as the company that was expanding aggressively, hiring for a new division, paying above market for the right professionals. I researched the company for weeks before applying. I read the published annual reports. I studied the technologies they used. I read interviews with senior engineers who had public profiles online. I mapped the projects that were likely in development based on what was public about their clients. When I finally put together the resume and cover letter, I knew more about Meridian than many mid-level employees probably did. I submitted the application on a Monday night. On Thursday morning, I received an email from HR asking to schedule an interview. I read the email 3 times. Then I set my phone on the table, went to the kitchen, made chai the way my mother made it, with cardamom and ginger and boiled milk, and sat in silence for about 10 minutes, drinking slowly, thinking about everything it had cost to arrive at that email. Then I went back to the table, opened my computer, replied confirming the date and time, and began preparing the only way I knew, completely. The director of engineering was named Patricia Holloway. I knew that before walking into the room because I had researched. 15 years at the company, a computer science degree from MIT, and a professional history that suggested someone who had gotten where she was through the same path I knew well: consistent work, accumulated over time, with no visible shortcuts. She had a column published in a technical journal about diversity in engineering teams that I had read twice. It was the kind of text a person writes when they genuinely believe what they're saying, not when they're trying to look good. That gave me a small margin of hope. The technical lead was Marcus Webb, early 30s, specialization in distributed systems architecture, active in open-source communities. I had found technical comments of his in some forums I frequented. They were precise and without vanity, the kind that prioritizes the solution over the ego. That was also a positive sign. The third person, from corporate HR, was named Sandra. She had smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes, and I decided, in that first second, to treat her as neutral. Neither ally nor obstacle. Simply present. Patricia began. So, Neha, tell me a little about your journey. This is the question that seems simple and isn't. Most candidates answer it in a linear, predictable way. School, university, first company, second company, numbered achievements. It is a correct answer. It is not a memorable answer. I had thought a great deal about how to answer that question, not to impress. To be honest in a way that was also strategic, because honesty without structure is just venting, and that wasn't what that room needed. What I wanted was that, when I finished speaking, Patricia and Marcus would feel they were in front of someone who had gotten to that point not by luck or favorable circumstance, but through a series of deliberate decisions made under real pressure. So I began with the old computer in Hyderabad. Not sentimentally. No drama, no pause for effect. I mentioned it directly. I learned to program at home, with limited equipment, without access to expensive formal courses, solving the problem of not being able to practice on a computer by writing code by hand and simulating the execution mentally. Patricia raised an eyebrow slightly. Marcus stopped looking at the tablet for a second and looked at me. I continued. I talked about university, about working part-time to help with expenses, about the decision to come to the United States knowing it would be hard, and that a different kind of hardship from familiar hardship is a particular type of challenge. I didn't ask for sympathy. I presented context. Then Marcus asked the first technical question. It was about a classic systems architecture problem. How would you design a payment processing service that needed to guarantee data consistency with high availability at minimum latency? It was an open question, the kind that doesn't have a single correct answer, and that serves less to test whether you know the solution, and more to observe how you think when there is no obvious path. I asked permission to use my notebook. Sandra looked at the notebook with a slightly surprised expression, as if paper notebooks in a technology interview were anachronistic. Marcus nodded. I opened to a blank page and began drawing as I spoke. I didn't draw the solution immediately. First, I articulated the constraints. Eventual consistency versus strong consistency, the trade-offs of the CAP theorem, the failure scenarios that needed to be considered before any architecture decision. Marcus leaned slightly forward. That small gesture told me everything I needed to know about whether I was on the right track. Then I presented 3 possible approaches, with the pros and cons of each, and explained which I would choose and why, not in absolute terms, but conditioned on specific variables of the use context. It was the answer of someone who had solved real problems, not of someone who had memorized interview answers. Marcus said simply, "Interesting." In a technical interview, interesting, said by a senior engineer with that specific tone, means more than most explicit praise. The second technical question came shortly after and was more specific. A debugging scenario in a microservices system, where a service was failing intermittently without clear error logs. How would I approach the diagnosis? I knew that problem inside and out. I had solved exactly that kind of situation at the Austin company, during a production incident that had lasted 2 nights, and that I had let alone because the responsible senior engineer was on leave. I told them directly, describing the process step by step, additional instrumentation, distributed tracing, temporal correlation analysis between apparently unrelated events, until identifying that the problem was a race condition in a cache operation that only manifested under specific load. Marcus looked at Patricia. It wasn't a long look. It was 1 second. But I had learned to read rooms over years of being in rooms where I needed to read them, and that look said, "This person knows what she's talking about." Patricia then moved to the behavioral questions. The first was about conflict. Tell me about a situation where you disagreed with a technical decision made by someone above you and how you handled it. I thought for 2 seconds before answering. Not because I didn't have examples, I had several, but because I wanted to choose the right example. Not the one that made me look most heroic, but the one that was most true and most revealing about how I actually function under pressure. I talked about Derek, not by name, but by situation. The architecture bottleneck I had predicted, the communication attempt that had been ignored, the production failure 3 months later. And I talked about what I had learned, that being right is not enough, that effective technical communication requires understanding not just the problem, but the political and relational context around it, and that I had changed my approach from that episode, moving toward building alignment before raising issues in meetings, and documenting technical positions with a clarity that made later revision easier. Patricia wrote something down. "And how do you handle ambiguity?" she asked. "Situations where you don't have all the information you need to make a decision?" I replied that ambiguity was the normal state of real engineering work, and that the relevant skill was not to eliminate ambiguity, that is rarely possible, but to learn to make reversible decisions quickly while continuing to gather information, and to communicate clearly which premises are sustaining each decision so they can be revised when new information arrives. Sandra, for the first time since we had begun, stopped looking at the tablet and looked at me directly. There was a brief pause in the room. Patricia turned a few pages of her notebook. Marcus was drawing something on his own pad. I couldn't see what, but the gesture had that quality of someone actively processing, not of someone disconnected. It was then that Patricia asked something I hadn't anticipated. "Neha, you mentioned that you learned to program largely self-taught, under limited conditions. How do you assess your own ability to learn new technologies today? In an environment of abundant resources compared to what you had before?" It was an intelligent question. She was, indirectly, asking whether the environment of scarcity had formed me in a way that depended on scarcity to function, whether I operated well under constraint, but got lost when there was abundance. I answered honestly. I said that scarcity had taught me to prioritize, to identify what is essential before beginning, to not waste resources on paths that don't lead to the solution, that this habit had become structural in my learning process, regardless of the environment. That in context of abundant resources, I had learned to use abundance deliberately rather than consuming it diffusely, choosing what to study based on where the impact would be greatest, not based on what was most accessible. And then I said something I hadn't planned to say, but that came out with a naturalness that surprised me. The difference is that before I learned out of necessity for survival, now I learn by choice, but the muscle is the same. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Marcus let out a breath that was almost a laugh, not mockery, but that kind of involuntary reaction that happens when something resonates in an unexpected way. Then Patricia closed her notebook. That small gesture I recognized. I had seen it in teachers, in managers, in people who make decisions. When someone closes their notebook in a conversation, it generally means the conversation has reached a point where additional notes are no longer necessary, where something has been concluded internally. She thanked me for my time. She said the process had one more step, a reference check and a conversation with the immediate team. and that I would receive a response within 5 business days. I thanked each one by name. I stood up. I picked up my bag. I left the second resume on the table as I had planned, and I left the room. In the hallway, on the way back to the elevator, I passed the waiting room. The other candidates were still there. Some. Others had already gone in and come out. The man in the white shirt was looking at his phone with the expression of someone who still didn't know how it had gone. The woman in the red lipstick was rereading something in a notebook. None of them looked at me when I passed. I got in the elevator. The doors closed. I looked at myself in the mirror this time. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I didn't know the result, and knew I wouldn't for days. But there was something in my own reflection that I recognized. The expression of someone who had left everything they had inside a room and kept nothing back. Whatever the result, I had done everything that could be done. The rest was not in my hands. I left the building and walked 3 blocks before sitting on a bench and calling my mother in Hyderabad. It was late at night there. She answered on the second ring, as always, because when I call, she is always awake, regardless of the hour. I said only, "I did what you taught me. The rest is in God's hands." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in that low and firm voice I had heard since childhood, "Then it is already done, my daughter." The following 5 business days were the longest of my adult life, not dramatically. I didn't stay paralyzed waiting, didn't stop working, didn't check my email every 10 minutes like an anxious version of myself that I had learned not to be. But there was a layer of constant awareness installed somewhere in the background of everything I did, a quiet presence that reminded me, constantly, that something important was pending and that I had no control over the outcome. I worked normally during those days. I solved a performance problem in a service that the Austin team had been postponing for weeks. I participated in 2 planning meetings. I had lunch with a colleague who had invited me to try a new restaurant near the office. I called my brother Arjun one afternoon, without a specific reason, just to hear his voice talk about his own life in Pune, about the new job, about the girlfriend he hadn't yet officially introduced to our parents, but that everyone already knew existed. On the 4th night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't anguish. It was something more like an involuntary vigil, the kind of insomnia that comes not from fear but from an anticipation the body doesn't know how to process. I lay in the dark for a while, listening to the sounds of the city outside, and then got up, made chai, sat by the small window of my apartment that looked out onto a side street and looked at the lights on in the buildings across the way. I thought about Hyderabad. I thought about the apartment where I grew up, the 2 bedrooms, the slightly crooked dark wood bookshelf with my mother's English books. I thought about Teacher Murthy and the 4 old computers in the lab. I thought about the nights at the internet cafe for 1 rupee and 20 per hour, about the flash drive I carried as if it were an important document, about the red-covered dictionary that had disintegrated from use before I turned 15. I thought about Derek and the meeting where my observation had been ignored. I thought about the woman in the red lipstick laughing discreetly in the Meridian waiting room. I thought about the man in the white shirt and his 2 words about my accent. And I thought about my mother, about the way she sewed late into the night under a light that wasn't good for her eyes, without complaining, because there were bills to pay, and children to raise, and dreams she had deposited in us with a silent generosity I had only begun to fully understand when I became an adult. About the way she had bought those English books one by one over the years, at the used bookstore near the market, spending money that could have gone elsewhere, because she believed that my children's world needs to be larger than mine. I stayed by the window until the chai grew cold. Then I went back to bed and slept. The email arrived on the morning of the 5th business day at 10:18. I was at the office when my phone vibrated. I saw the sender, an address from Meridian Tech Solutions, and felt my heart accelerate in a way that was not under my control. I set my phone on the table. I breathed. I looked at the computer screen in front of me for about 3 seconds, as if I needed an anchor before opening the message. Then I picked up the phone and opened the email. The first line was from Sandra in HR. "Dear Neha, it is my pleasure to inform you." I stopped reading. Not because I didn't want to continue, but because those 6 words, "It is my pleasure to inform you," were enough for me to know. There is no polite way to begin a rejection with "it is my pleasure." There is only one thing that comes after that opening. I read the rest slowly. They had completed the evaluation process of all candidates. The decision had been made based on technical ability, practical experience, and cultural fit with the team. They were pleased to extend to me a formal offer for the position of Senior Systems Engineer in the new Infrastructure Division of Meridian Tech Solutions, Austin, Texas. The salary was what I had researched as the ceiling for that position in the market, They asked me to confirm interest so they could send the formal offer package with all the details of benefits, proposed start date, and next steps in the onboarding process. I read the email 3 times, not because I doubted what was written, but because there was something in the act of reading the words repeatedly that made them more real, that closed the space between what had happened and what I was beginning to process as truth. I set my phone on the table. I looked at the computer screen. I looked at the window. I looked at my hands in front of me. And then, for the first time in a long time, I cried. It wasn't a cry of relief, although there was relief. It wasn't of joy, although there was joy. It was a cry of that specific kind that happens when something you have carried for a long time, alone, finally finds a place to land. It was the cry of years. It was the old computer and the red-covered dictionary, and the nights at the internet cafe and Derek and the waiting room, with the discreet laughter and my mother awake at 3 a.m. in Hyderabad, answering on the second ring. It was all of that at once, arriving together. It lasted about 2 minutes. Then I dried my face, breathed deeply, and replied to the email confirming interest and thanking them for the opportunity with the same clarity and precision I had used throughout the entire process. That evening, I called my mother. It was late in Hyderabad, close to midnight. She answered on the second ring. I said, "I got it, Mum." There was a silence of perhaps 4 or 5 seconds. Then she began to cry. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just cried, quietly. In that way, I recognized as her way of feeling things that are too large to fit into words. And I stayed on the other end of the line, in Austin, Texas, in a small apartment 15,000 kilometers away, listening to that crying as if it were the most beautiful thing I had heard in years. When she managed to speak, she said only, "I knew." 2 words, but I understood exactly what they contained. All the silent faith she had deposited in me across decades, all the nights sewing under poor light, all the English books bought one by one at the used bookstore, all the times she had believed when I still didn't quite know what to believe in. I knew. The first day at Meridian was on a Monday in October. I got in the same mirrored elevator. This time, I looked at myself in the reflection during the entire ride up, not out of vanity, but because there was something I needed to see, the person who had gotten to that point, where she had come from, what it had cost. Patricia Holloway received me personally in the reception area. She took me to meet the team, 7 people, diverse in origin and background. With that quality, I had learned to recognize in teams that truly work: mutual curiosity, respect for each other's work, an informality that didn't compromise technical seriousness. Marcus was in a meeting but stepped out for a moment to greet me. He said he had been satisfied with the process, that there were some interesting problems waiting for me, and that he liked people who thought out loud while drawing in their notebooks. We smiled. In the months that followed, I worked harder than I had worked at any other job, not because they demanded it. Meridian was, by far, the healthiest environment I had ever worked in, but because something was different in that experience. For the first time in years, I felt that the work I produced was received for what it was, without unnecessary filters, without the extra layer of skepticism I had learned to expect. When I raised a technical point in a meeting, I was heard. When I disagreed with an approach, the disagreement was discussed on its merits. When I spoke, with my Indian accent, strong and clear, the voice of someone who learned English pausing American videos in a dark room in Hyderabad, people listened to what I was saying. That sounds like a small thing. It is not. There is something I want to say to whoever is reading this and recognizes some part of this story as their own. To those who grew up with little and learned that limited resources demand unlimited creativity. To those who learned English the hard way, without expensive schools, without an immersive environment, without anyone to correct pronunciation along the way. To those who walked into rooms where people exchanged glances before you even sat down. To those who have heard discreet laughter and had to decide in a second what to do with it. The accent is not the problem. The accent is the proof. It is proof that you learned something that was not your native language, that you crossed a distance that most of the people laughing never had to cross. Every different inflection, every stress placed in an unexpected spot, every cadence that sounds strange to an ear that never had to adapt, all of it is evidence of effort, of courage, of an intelligence that did not surrender to difficulty. No one who built something alone, from scratch, with their own hands, needs to apologize for the way they speak. The waiting room will have laughter. The meeting will have Derek's. The path will have people who decide, before hearing a single word you have to say, that you are not enough. Let them decide. Then walk into the room, open your notebook, and show what you know. Today, 2 years after that interview, I lead an engineering team at Meridian. Yesterday, in a candidate evaluation meeting for a junior position on my team, one of the recruiters mentioned that a candidate had a very strong accent and that this might be a communication problem with clients. I leaned slightly forward and said, "Tell me more about his technical skills." The recruiter began talking about the technical skills, and the interview continued.